Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to continue with what we talked about last time, which is the broad territory of planning and motor control. I guess the overlap is not exactly all that much with last time, but so I'll try to sort of, in fact, it's a good opportunity to recap some of the ideas from one of the models, the direct model, in the context of the DIVA model and the way that Frank Guenther has explained it, and it gives another angle on the same learning problem that it's trying to solve. So basically, last time we looked at two aspects of movement control. One is controlling muscles in a way that they receive multiplicative go signals so that you get the muscles to extend or basically the muscles to contract at roughly the same time. And there are lots of interesting arguments for why that ought to take place to prevent jerky movements. And also the fact that the observations of actual movements bear that out more or less. So that's sort of emergent process with it, because there's many effectors, but they kind of all act in what's known, in fact, the technical term is synergy. So we looked at synergies, and the VEAT model, vector integration to endpoint model, just focuses on that. And that Dan Bullock worked with Steve Grossberg to develop that. And then they worked with Frank Guenther to kind of embed that idea in a system that does the mapping from a sensory space to motor space. So to recap, the metaphor that I provided last time was when a person is controlling like a remote control car, and let's say that they have a map in front of them, they're going from visual coordinates to the coordinates of the controller, and they are completely different spaces, and they often have different numbers of degrees of freedom or dimensions. So in the case of space, you have maybe 2 or 3 dimensions. In the case of articulators, quite a few dimensions. Let's assume that it's not like a remote control car just has those 2 degrees, but let's say there are more if it's like a PlayStation controller. So there's more things you can do. So how do you do this mapping? It's something that robotics people think about a lot, and they have a couple of interesting solutions. It's actually interesting to look into that and how differential geometry becomes quite useful in that space. So what the direct model does is kind of take one of the key ideas from the robotics literature and comes up with a sort of neurally plausible way for some of that to be learned. So the basic problem is the inverse kinematic problem, which is that when you're going from articulator space to a target space, like if I'm picking some point in my field of vision that I want to reach to, there are infinitely many ways to get there, because the number of articulators that I have far exceeds the dimensions of space. So what do you do when you're like spoiled for choice in terms of ways to get from point A to point B in joint space? Meaning you can use joint space to get from point A to point B in visual space. That's called the inverse kinematics problem. And we brought up how Nikolai Bernstein was one of the people who talked about this and framed it in terms of degrees of freedom. So when you first think about how you might do this, you might think, well, I'll map targets in space to targets in joint space. So it's like I want to go from A to B in space, so I shall go from A to B in effector space. So it's like creating templates for the actual configuration that you want to be in. And there's an argument that this is less efficient than mapping from targets in space to directions. So it's vector mapping instead of and there's an interesting mathematical kind of trick here, which is that if you use a Jacobian, which is a linearization, and you're trying to push something along using vectors that control just movement, then any sum of those solutions of those kind of bumps is continuous in joint space. So think of it like this: it's like when I have my arm in a particular position, if you give me instructions like go over there and make sure that your elbow is at position this and your fingers are at position Y, that's quite tricky. But if I say, well, move your elbow a little bit this way and move your hand a little bit that way, in the coordinates of wherever you are now, you can always do that. And that's basically what the model sets up itself to do. Some of it is fixed, kind of, but some of it is learned. So the DIVA model is a speech version of the same basic problem. So you can compare the two. What we had on the spatial side was I have some present position vector. Like let's say that I've decided that the point at the end of my finger is the spatial position that I'm interested in. And I have some target, which is where I'd like the finger to be. Then I have a map that combines visual dimensions with motor dimensions. So I convert a spatial direction vector, which is basically like the error, which is like I'm here and I'd like to be here. So I have a vector difference that I use to say I need to get from here to there. What do I do with that difference? That difference is not in the language of effectors. So this position direction map is learned. So well, actually it's learned, but in the direct model, they kind of stipulate it, but you can actually learn it with a self-organizing map. What's learned is how to go from a map like that to motor directions. And that the way that it's learned is through, in this case, the motor equivalent of babbling. So during the developmental stage, in the case of babies or the model, a mapping is learned between, so you're just randomly moving your effectors and learning what the sensory consequences of that are. And which movement commands produced certain sensory consequences. So there are two sets of learned weights in the direct model that allow you to map from your position to joint configuration map to joint direction vectors. So there's maps and vectors, two different ways of representing information. And then there's a reverse map, which is learned mainly because once we're well trained in something, it's pretty easy to like move in the dark. Interestingly, that is not present in the DIVA model, or at least in this early version that I looked at. You could say partly because in the case of vision, we are reasonably good at moving without visual feedback. But in the case of hearing, like if you plug up your ears, your ability to articulate is quite degraded. So the equivalent of reaching in a blind room is not so, it's not clear how well we do that in the case of sound. So what is the problem? The problem is, how do I control the effectors of the lips, the mouth, the tongue, the vocal cords to produce sounds? So the effectors in this case are everything that produces sound. And so there's in the case of, and the sensory domain is audition rather than vision. So that's the way that these two sets of models are the same. So you have to map sound space to articulator space, and then map sound goals to articulator directions. So this part is exactly what the direct model was. So they sort of imported that to do mapping from sound to commands. So yeah, so once you get an articulator vector, you're not stipulating the end goal of the effectors, but you're giving the articulators pushes, vectors in the direction of where you'd like to be. That gets mapped up onto the sensory so that you have an error signal about whether you've successfully produced the sound that you wanted to produce or not. And that goes back so that you can zero out once you've said the thing that you wanted to say. So we can look into how Frank Guenther presents this, because that gives another angle on what the direct model is doing and what the nature of this type of problem is. So this is from that paper. And it reviews different attempts specifically in the speech control domain. And at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was no unified perspective on how speech motor control develops due to lack of attention to speech acquisition. To some extent, this problem is still there, even though deep learning is all about learning. But it's not paying close attention to how actual people learn. So this model is called DIVA. It's directions into velocities of articulators, which is more or less what the direct model does, which was also developed by Frank. And so, yeah, so it's doing what I just said, basically the babbling and learning these mappings, and the learning process uses only information available to an infant. So there are no training sets for the systems mappings as in backpropagation algorithms. And all learning laws governing the model synapses use only information directly available from the pre and postsynaptic cells. So the learning is local. There's no moving errors around or doing anything non-local. So to the extent that it works, it does things using constraints that we kind of want neural models to obey. So there's an interesting point that they make in this paper, which they didn't really need to make in the direct model paper. So there's many different ways you can produce a sound, which is similar to the idea of getting to a position in space. But the difference is that there's quite a bit of variation you can produce in a phoneme while still successfully making the sound that other people will understand. So what that means is that unlike space, where you either reach it or not, there's a little bit more looseness in terms of landing on the phoneme. And they also found that even when you kind of produce more or less the correct phoneme, there's many different articulator positions that can produce that. And with constraints, you can still talk. So Groucho can talk with a cigar in his mouth. You can do, you don't really need to do any additional learning in order to figure out how to produce the sounds you want to produce with a cigar in your mouth. So, so they talk about this mapping in terms of convex region theory. Steve doesn't actually talk about this in his book, as far as I know, much, so he doesn't elaborate on it. But it's an interesting idea that the orosensory space, this mapping from sensory and to motor control, includes not only the positions of individual articulators, but also a lot of other information from pressure receptors, and each dimension specifies a range of acceptable positions. So you're actually learning this, like how many different positions in articulator space and sound space are acceptable. And clearly that will vary depending on the language. And they draw attention to the fact that what constitutes successfully producing a phoneme really depends on the language. So they don't actually model that in this model, but that, you know, art and things like that will kind of cover that aspect of it, which is the sensory pattern recognition aspect. So here's an illustration of what they mean by convex region. So some of you may know what a convex hull of a set of data points is. It's like if you have a group of points in a space and you connect them, then the convex hull of that is such that any 2 points inside that space should be connected by a straight line that doesn't have to pass outside that structure. It's maybe too much mathematics for this particular purpose, but they brought it up. So I think the 2 examples that they give are the region for the vowel I and the consonant P sound. So it's like the first time you hear, the baby hears an I sound, E sound, there's some space. So basically the baby is producing sounds, and through the feedback with the person that's training them or through their own feedback, they're like, okay, that's a sound, this is how I can produce that sound. And later something else is sort of assessed as being the same sound, but it was produced using different articulators and has different or different positions of the articulators, and it has different auditory qualities slightly. So you learn that the lip aperture, there's a large margin of error, and the lower lip height too can also vary. So now you have, instead of a couple of points, you actually just fill in the whole space that is defined by those 2 data points, and anything in there counts as an I sound. For P, it's narrow in one particular domain, the lip aperture. Lips have to touch each other somewhat or get at least close. Whereas there's some variability in how you can achieve that. So one thing that struck me was this wasn't really mentioned in the direct model. I kind of touched on this just now. So what is distinctive about sound articulator mapping versus vision articulator mapping? Thoughts on this? Because I thought it was interesting that they needed to bring it up here and not there. And I think the basic reason is like I said, that visual goals are often easier to specify. But it would be, but I guess it's the case that if you're playing a particular game or even doing certain kinds of navigation, what constitutes successfully reaching the goal can vary. And we can change that on the fly, which is something, I don't know whether this will do that because some of this is learned, but then it's an interesting thing to think about, which is that, so in these cases with error maps, you're kind of trying to reduce something until your error gets to 0. But what that 0 is can vary and be a kind of a consequence of various things like even arousal and sleepiness and how energetic you are. Okay. So this mapping from oral space to oral space is equivalent to what we saw in the direct model going from visual space to joint space. So don't really need to go over this again. They're using our opponent processes. So because each muscle can only contract, so you need an opponent muscle to move in the opposite way. So they use that same idea here. This we've seen before. There's an endogenous random generator that's very important during the learning stages. So that's directly has a access to the articulator vectors. So it's pushing the articulators around to produce various sounds, and then through feedback through the whole system that is sent back, and compared with the target. In the case of when you're learning, you don't actually have a target that's very distinct from what you produced. So that's an interesting consequence of this, which is that while you're learning what you're capable of, your goal and what you just did align fairly closely. They can't be perfectly aligned because you need a non-zero signal to work so basically a weak error signal to give you the basis for learning. So yes, that's the learning here. And what I don't know, if probably you guys CNS people haven't looked at all this in a while, but in the direct model, there isn't like a derivative sitting right there to be learned. But I think there's something, so basically they use an error signal of where I was just now versus where I am now. So they use 2 different time steps. And this is the continuous version of that. So for someone interested in synaptic learning rules and learning rules in general, this type of thing is interesting because it's sort of Hebbian, but it's like a differential Hebbian map. It's like half Hebbian, half differential. The reason I say that is that there's an articulator command signal, this A signal, and this error signal. So you're learning a rate of change, you're kind of strengthening a weight based on a rate of change as well as of an activity as well as an activity, which is an interesting variation on Hebbian style learning. So yeah, they say that when you set things up, the learning can be pretty rapid. I wonder if do any of you know if like robotics uses this sort of thing, or learning laws that are equivalent. I don't look at that literature much, so I don't know. Right, so yeah, I just drew attention to that. So one thing that hasn't really been talked about is, well, once you've learned this mapping, how do you produce something that you want to say? In the case of space, the temporal aspect of it is not front and center. If you're saying I want to reach there, your goal, at least in the simple simulations that the direct model was performing, the goal is fixed. You could imagine that you need to sort of move here, then move there, then move there, and that would be a sequence. But that's sort of required for any kind of production of sound, because even the simplest sounds are a sequence of configurations of the articulator.
So even in the direct models, if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I've properly read those papers, but I do think that there's this sort of analog there where at all moments in time, you're calculating a difference vector between where you are
Right.
and what your target is, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah, the d by dt is equivalent to that in that.
Yeah.
The dv
yeah,
itself.
and so essentially you have this beautiful system that like, you know, let's there's an analogous model with, you know, a two-wheeled robot, let's say, right? And if your treads on those wheels start going, right, the motor control commands that you've learned previously aren't going to do exactly the thing that you thought they would. But because you're constantly updating your difference vector to your target, then you can always sort of course correct and rehead without having to have, you know, a whole new learning process that kicks off and so on and so on.
Yeah, they do one simulation of that. Even in the weak model, they do that where they sort of change tack midway, and you get a smooth correction. The reason I brought this up here was just that the sequencing part in the DIVA model is just assumed, but that's a nice seg into this other class of models, the competitive queuing models. So basically up here, you have a phoneme string production, and that is extrinsic to this model. And you can say, well, where does that come from? But of course, it's Steve. He's thought about all of this already since the 60s. And that's where competitive queuing comes in. I thought, well, I kind of wish Steve had spent more time on this in the book. He kind of goes through it pretty quickly. And also, the stuff he talks about is his reasoning from the 70s about why it should be a certain way. But now there's a fair amount of data. And this paper, in fact, Dan Bullock sent it to me a couple of years ago, showing competitive queuing evidence using MEG in humans. So there's a whole lot of data now collected basically since the late 90s, around the 2000, around then. And this is one of the few Grossbergian models that is widely adopted, and people seem to know that he's the one who developed them. So that's fairly rare in neuroscience. And I think part of the reason is that if you actually, it's not that hard to understand how it works. If you read Steve's own treatments, especially the one from 78, it's a little tricky. But if you read how Dan has explained it in Dan Bullock has explained it in reviews, it's fairly clear. And other people, I think, just sort of reinvented it or came up with versions of it, which are probably also, the presentations are probably straightforward to understand. So this Kornisheva et al., Neil Burgess's group, show that the competitive queuing of upcoming action representations extends previous results. And so it shows that the brain learns and controls multiple sequences by flexibly combining representations of specific actions and interval timing with high-level parallel representations of sequence position. So what's cool about this is the fact that when you first think about how to make a sequence, you might think, well, if I want A, then B, then C, then D, then maybe I should just chain them so that A excites B, B excites C. And a lot of people are doing things like that, or things that was inspired by computer science, like shift registers and things like that. And the idea that this sort of classic seemingly serial behavior, doing things one at a time, requires parallel activation, and something sitting in parallel is maybe initially counterintuitive, but now I think a lot of people are on board with it. So yes, so-called competitive queuing. Steve didn't come up with this name. He called it item and order. Competitive queuing is a much better name because it basically explains what the model is. Formally explain this behavior, yeah, like I said, there's a parallel preparation.
I don't know. I kind of like item in order. I won't lie.
What? Why?
Because it's the same set of representations or neurons or whatever stores both the items that have been presented and the order they were presented.
So the ordinal, it's not just about ordinality, right? It's what it is storing. So it's actually pretty cool.
Ah, I see. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah,
that's a good argument. I suppose.
So if you're Saurabh or someone like Steve who wants to build like language-like models on top, then that's the way to go, right? Like I don't want to be like.
Oh, this is interesting. So wait, have you spoken to Chomsky and Berwick about this?
Not yet. Will soon.
because now I get it why sort of likes it. So just to give some context here, I think a lot of people struggle to map temporal phenomena and ordinal phenomena onto information. There's a tendency, I think, for people to separately assume that there's this static sort of eternal repository of information, and then you kind of like either sample for it or move it to some kind of working space and do stuff there. And item and order, actually, yeah, you're right. It does actually convey the fact that, I mean, if you item and order in the same neuron is the idea that you don't need to separately code for what the item is and when it needs to appear in a sequence. Similarly, in the case of timing, a lot of people are like talking about time cells, and people have, but like, if you think about what people are reporting in the hippocampus and elsewhere, they don't work on using some principle that's different from how a place cell works. Like once you think about what a place cell is doing, right? It's not magically processing what place is, right? It has to be processing some sort of input. And depending on the nature of that input, it will look like a place cell or a time cell. So there's nothing magical about adding out these other types of information. Once you have a clear model for what produces that type of neural response. So yeah, this when you don't think in terms of a more mechanistic network, the tendency is to assume that every conceivable piece of information is in a separate part of the brain.
And it's easy to get away with things like, oh, the brain has got this push down stack and therefore
Right.
you get all this functionality or whatever. But actually, if you take the constraints that like, well, would the brain have evolved a system to push around some sort of symbol that, you know, is dissociated from anything that's based on the activation from position to, there's no way the brain is doing that, evolved to do that, and so on. So taking these simple mechanisms, the question becomes, what are the constraints that you can draw from that, right? And so I think there'd be a lot of interesting, you know, if formal linguists were to say, okay, what are the brain mechanisms, what are the neural mechanisms that might explain certain linguistic phenomena? I think there's potentially a lot of interesting, you know, material to be mined there.
100%, which is why I was thinking, the general sort of scheme here is stuff that you think might be separate, might be being done in the same network. And I think maybe Chomsky and Berwick might be curious. Because Karthik was saying that they don't actually know that much about these neural models. So yeah, this is more or less just what their data was. And so how does it work? Like I said, the name competitive queuing kind of tells you what should happen, because the competition part, we've talked about it a lot in this group, and getting a basic winner-take-all system to work, where you have a group of neurons that receive, or ensembles of neurons that self-excite and have lateral inhibition of each other ensemble. Whether that's a shunting network using Steve's equations or a spiking network, you can get this to work very easily. It's one of the easiest mechanisms to get working, regardless of what your neural mechanism is. So once you have the idea of competition, what does that mean? That you're basically saying that order is represented in a kind of parallel ranking. They call it primacy gradient. So to say that, well, this first thing gets some sort of high activity, the second one gets next highest activity, and so on. And then when you feed that into a competitive network, you just need to, then you just pick the winner, which has the highest activity. And the most important thing then is, on the time scale at which you need to move along, you have to reset and suppress what has already happened. Here, a lot of subtlety comes in when you have like repeated items and stuff like that. And but rather than having to have separate slots for items depending on whether they're first or third or 10th, you just have the same representation of the items. And when you want to reorder them, you change the primacy gradient. so that's quite a neat use of the neural real estate. So that's what this is showing basically, that I have, in this case, letters. For some reason, they chose an example, an Australian example, good day. Was Brad Rhodes Australian? I don't know. So basically, the first letter is G. So when you've loaded up your command, G will have the highest activity. And the way this works, you can get it to work well using purely short-term memory. So if you want to repeat a phone number in sequence, just the order in which it's been presented to you will cause an order of activity in this planning layer without any long-term memory changes, which reflects our experience of learning quickly, like using a phone number, is that it's in through one ear and sort of almost out the other. It lasts long enough for you to produce it. And then subsequent learning, you need repetition. So all you need is to create this plan.
Yohan, we should add that primacy gradient kind of works only if the number of representations are small enough.
Okay.
On the other hand, if the sequence is longer, you see a U-shaped effect. So in the sense that that's very typical of most of us when we try to remember this, right? We remember that the first few things very well and the last few things very well, and it's the one in the middle that's problematic. So it's sort of like this whole approach that Steve has is not just, so I think when people talk about competitive queuing, they only are interested in that original primacy gradient. They can't answer that U curve, the shape back.
Right.
So that's why Steve goes into much more detail about why his model should behave in a certain way.
Yeah, it's quite an impressive what the kind of stuff that he chooses to go through in the 70s paper, in the 1978 paper.
The one other thing that I think is really impressive, excuse me, impressive about the model. This is all based on center off surround, like recurrent competitive fields. This is basically the same thing that gives you, contrast normalization, all of the stuff that makes, vision models work, all of the stuff that, we've seen previously for layer normalization for whatever other neural model he's working on. It also gives rise to the same item in order working memory. And so there's this nice sort of unifying thread of, simple principles, simple circuitry can give rise to all of these different interesting properties and behaviors. Yeah.
It's like it's a type of unification, but it's using these Lego blocks that the getting them to work in different contexts is where the challenge can be, because unlike whipping out an RNN, you can't just say concatenate a bunch of layers and then press enter and hope for the best. So here this is a review that Dan and Brad Rhodes did on this, and they talk about how. So this is a 2-layer version of this competitive choice, and primacy gradient is a kind of very important aspect of this. So you could say, well, what else is there? What are they? What other sort of model might you think of? And the Kornysheva paper actually gives a good kind of glimpse at what else was on the table, especially in the 70s, but even subsequently. There was a behaviorist idea that each sequence element serves as a conditioning stimulus for the subsequent element during the formation of complex behaviors. So I actually came across this type of model during my work. It was called the behaviorist model of timing. And it just assumes that the animal is cycling through states, and all it needs to do is do basic associative chaining between state A and one before it. So it's a very, very serial model, and you have to kind of step through the whole thing in order to produce this. There's all kinds of reasons that this doesn't quite work, and apparently a lot of recurrent neural networks do the same thing. Even now, and this paper is from 2019. So
what?
So
I might dispute that.
Yeah, okay, because they didn't cite anything there. So, but Dan actually says the same thing in this paper in 2003. So an RNN in a certain restrictive usage is a network in which each output is fed back to the input as a way of helping to create a distinctive context for eliciting the correct next output. So it's like, having been there, I feed that back and use that as the context for the next association. In such an RNN, the representation of the learned sequence is itself fundamentally serial, in the sense that the information that specifies the sequence only becomes available as the serial performance unfolds. So there's no parallel planning layer. Are you saying that that's not the case for all of the RNNs?
I would say basically that the kind of serial chaining that you get in those behaviorist type models are things where, either at 1 hop or 2 hops or 3 hops or n number of hops, these previous steps, 1 step, 2, 3, 4 steps, will elicit the next response. RNNs have, in principle, the possibility of representing the whole history such that, the next decision is not sort of a Markov, there's no Markov property that's necessarily entailed, right? And so I think in that sense, it's slightly different. There is that, linear progression, obviously, that, if you have this history unfolding, that is what ultimately decides the next step. But it's, in my mind, similar to what happens even in an item in order and competitive queuing model, like,
in the sense that there's like near perfect working memory.
Well, even if you imagine like you have top-down excitation of partially activated, let's say a word, right? If I've said part of a word and I've activated some higher level, category for that word that's feeding back top-down excitation, the history of the portion of the word that I've seen so far is priming essentially what I'm expecting to see in the future. So in the same way as an RNN is, the history of what I've seen so far sort of primes or elicits the next response.
Okay, but the very fact that you need that type of priming means that you're not using this type of gradient. So we have priming as opposed to primacy gradient, right?
Yeah, but I mean, the primacy gradient here is what activates the top-down activation, like the top-down category node that ends up priming the future sort of not yet seen inputs. So I think there's a similarity here with RNNs that, at the very least, one of the arguments for RNNs as opposed to like Markov chains or whatever is that you don't have this Markov property of the next decision being only dependent on the previous time step or previous n number of time steps. In essence, the RNN can potentially represent the whole history so that your next decision is, effectively based on that, is conditioned on that whole thing as opposed to a fixed number of time steps.
Yeah, I think the argument that Saurabh is kind of making is at the level of that RNN, it's almost impossible for us to determine if we are to come up with a way to say that this is the primacy gradient for a given sequence or something, given a bunch of parallel representations. It's almost impossible for you to differentiate between what will constitute a primacy gradient versus the history which acts as the priming itself, right? The primacy gradient is sort of like evolving along with the process of sequencing or reading out something. So it's almost impossible. Like if you assume that these are like individual dumb cells or whatever, they're not going to be like suddenly having this representation for a primacy gradient. They're just going to co-evolve in a sense, and sort of RNNs can kind of do that.
Yeah, they're essentially doing like random projections. You could think of it even. They're not going to be random, but they're doing projection.
But at the level of synapses, the CQ in this form doesn't even require any learning, right? So there isn't any associative chaining in sort of the garden variety CQ.
Sure, but if you have an RNN with random connections, you're effectively taking whatever your input sequence is and projecting it potentially into a high dimensional random, projection. That in principle could represent the whole history without loss, right? Yeah. And so unlike the associative chaining models where you really are restricted, at time step t, I'm only granted access to what was happening at time step t-1. The RNN in principle has access to that whole history because that random projection might.
You still need to do associative learning to trigger the next thing, right? Or not?
Yep, you do.
It depends on what you mean by the next thing. Some input would come in and you would have another, let's say, random projection. You're representing the input sequence in a totally new way. If you want to do something meaningful with that, then yes, you have to, that would require learning. You know what I mean?
But yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
The fun, I mean, it's so funny, like reading that thing about Herb Terra's work, right? Like, it's like, I'm just imagining like what will happen if your entire brain was to be filled with a n to the whatever space of HMMs, and then somehow like every time you have to choose a sequence, it's like one of those tree paths will be activated, is the claim that they're making. It's like almost like an argument from incredulity, and somehow there are lots of takers for that.
Yeah, even now, and there's new iterations of it that I won't name.
Remarkable.
So yeah, so now there's a lot of neural evidence. So in this Bullock review from 2004, he says that until 2002 there wasn't really any compelling evidence for this sort of thing. This is a simulation from I think Boardman and Bullock, or yeah, Boardman and Bullock, I think, to show precisely this is the competition layer. So you have, as you're running it, the first element gets excited, then it shuts itself off. Next one, so you run through the sequence. And I guess, I mean, they got data that just couldn't be better. Like in terms of looking exactly what you kind of would hope it would look like. So this was a task Bruno Averbeck and colleagues did where this was a monkey task where they were making shapes. The particular shapes that I think were with a joystick, triangle, square,
square, and a trapezoid.
Yeah, and they found cells that correlated not just with what was currently being executed, but future actions. So they had to perform them in sequence in order to get the reward. And as you can see, like if you look, for instance, at this pink square one, basically it was lower and then it kind of comes up. So it looks pretty much like what you'd expect from the competition layer of a CQ cell. And that was in 2002, and the data have been coming in at a reasonable clip. That 2019 paper was MEG beta data that also is quite clear. So I don't have that many slides for this because this paper doesn't have that many diagrams, but so his reasoning was not obviously based on neural data because there wasn't any. He was mainly thinking about two sets of data: the recall of sequential data and free recall. This I think I really like. So this, you might, if you're very sort of narrowly focused on a specific problem, you may not even realize that free recall and serial recall might have something in common. But like free recall of something that has been presented to you in sequence. So when I give you a list of words or letters, and I tell you to just remember them in whatever order you feel like. The probability of recall tends to be biased towards the first few and the last few. And the order of recall, you kind of are good at recalling what was, and more or less you remember in order, but then there's a slight bias towards the later items once you get to the later stages. So depending on the number of items and how fast you have to recall them, you might not see that much of the primacy effect, or so you can modulate this a little bit. But Steve was looking at this and saying, well, what does this tell us about the nature of the memory process? So he goes into a fairly detailed argument about why the shift registers, computer-based analogy, is somewhat ad hoc and doesn't give you a good mechanism for readout. So basically you have to separate, like Saurabh was saying, you have to separate items and orders, so that the item has to retain its identity as it shifts in this. Imagine that you have like a stack where literally like they have in computer, right? Where something enters and then it kind of moves as you add things. What's it called? Pop and push and all of that. So that's one way of doing things, but it doesn't actually help you explain the human recall data. So I really like what he does here, which is to initially set up behavioral contrast in space or in sensory space. So what he means by behavioral contrast is, this is a great example. So if a pigeon is rewarded on errorless discrimination trials for pecking on a key illuminated by a light, so there's a light at a particular wavelength, then there'll be a sort of response curve around that wavelength, and then later on you can, if you punish it for a different wavelength somewhere nearby, then during extinction the pigeon pecks more vigorously, at a shifted wavelength, so not where it was originally what it had learned, but shifted. So so if this is the original positive association around the wavelength space, and then there's a negative association that's built, if you were to just subtract, you would get part of the answer, which is that the peak response shifts, but you wouldn't get the fact that the response is even higher than normal. And here's another sort of version of a theme that Steve keeps returning to, which is that normalization can explain a lot. It's quite a nice little illustration of that, which is that you're not just comparing fuzzy representations of good and bad. You're not merely subtracting. You're subtracting and then normalizing. And that gives you this type of behavioral profile. So there's not really a good diagram for you. So you have to kind of imagine now that something like this is happening in serial item presentation, where when I hear something, that will produce a working memory trace, which will do two things. It will interfere with things that come after, but also things that come after will interfere with it. So this is what actually in chapter 1 of the introduction, Steve talks about backwards effects in time. And this is what he means, that on the one hand, what you expect, your history will influence what's happening currently by virtue of traces. We call them memory traces in some contexts or eligibility context traces in others. But basically, through any kind of competitive lateral inhibition kind of structure, your items, even if they don't overlap with each other in time at all, by virtue of having working memory traces and a lateral inhibition, will interfere with each other. And he explains the Boeing effect. So basically the effect is that in order to learn something, you may need to repeat. But basically, here is where Steve brings in associative learning or something like that. If I have item A, then B, then C, then D, and the working memory trace for A starts to fall or stay for a little while, and then B comes on, then I can form an association between A and B. But because of the inhibition, the strength of that signal starts to decrease. And then as you add more and more of these items that are remaining, they're all getting weaker through lateral inhibition. Then by the end of it, towards the end of a longish sequence, the earliest items, their working memory traces have actually decayed to nothing. And then, so for the last few items, they're experiencing less lateral inhibition than the middle items. So that's how you get the fact that the activity goes up again, and you see a recency effect. So their strength is higher, and the underlying assumption there is that the strength of an item representation, meaning its firing rate, will, all other things being equal, be proportional to strength of the synaptic weight change, and therefore to recall probability. It's quite a neat little way of taking what is fairly, you can sort of literally see it in the case of the spatial example, and then transpose that into the time domain, so that items that are in sequence are also running in parallel in a planning layer, and through lateral inhibition producing both the primacy and the recency effects. So that's quite cool. Yeah, so I was actually trying to simulate some of this. I didn't actually add that many slides this time, but we have plenty of time now to talk about this or other things. I can actually show you what I simulated also. Or if anyone wants me to go back and talk about something in the slides, let me know. Dig up that simulation. So yeah, I wanted to go slowly over this because in the book, Steve really tears through all this, and then kind of gets back to art-like models. So art stream. And I think now, since we've talked about art a bit, we have some intuition about it, but we'll kind of go over it again in the context of things that are constantly time varying, because what the project that Mark is working on fits nicely with that. And then we'll talk about masking fields. So Saurabh, if you're free next week, will you be willing to like walk us through masking fields or comment if I say something wrong?
I will do my my best to be here.
Cool, because yeah, I always found that to be like slightly tricky concept, but yeah, basically in chapter 12 we talked about Saurabh's work, so we'll try and cover some of that. It's pretty cool.
Saurabh, a slightly different note. Do you have a draft of the competitive queuing module you did for Celeste with Matt? Because that was really phenomenal.
Was it a presentation you're thinking of, or?
Well, it was a set
paper.
of presentations, and I think you actually had a module. It was the Celeste thing that you guys were doing.
I may actually. Let me look as Yohan's pulling up this simulation. Let me look. I may be able to find something.
I actually was thinking more about the primacy gradient than the competitive part, because the competition part works pretty well, and the resets, you kind of have to imagine that there's some temporal structure or some reason that the reset takes place at a particular time scale. So there's a lot more. You kind of have to add a certain amount of infrastructure for that.
So for anyone who's interested in this line of work from Steve, I've actually shared his more extensive monograph, which actually also includes all this, also written in 1978. It's like a 140 page.
Yeah, I have not yet looked at that.
It's a 140 page book, so you can read it. I'll also add, I think maybe Saurabh will agree with me on this. I'll also add that 1978, you should read all the papers of Steve Grossberg if you're a Grossberg fan from 1978, because it's probably his greatest year.
Huh.
Yeah, that are you thinking of that serial binary continuous parallel?
Yeah,
that paper. If you want to read one paper on this topic, that's the paper.
Yeah.
If you want to know why other working memory models don't do the trick and this one really does, and why that one's just, it's beautiful. It's compact, it's succinct, it's clear, it's sensible. It's good.
Maybe I'll try and look at that next time. So this code is a big mess, but I'll just show you. This is what I was doing 10 minutes before 15 minutes before I started this. But
so Mark hasn't already convinced you to ditch Python and move to Julia?
I'm thinking about it, but I'm also lazy. So yeah, maybe next time I will start doing that. And apparently there's an art package in Julia now, which is amazing. Very curious to see how that works. But yeah, so basically the trick, which I initially thought would be super easy, but actually does involve a slightly modified shunting network, is you want, so here I have different items coming on at different times, and to load that into working memory, you need the parallel activation to mirror the order in which things arrived. So the first thing needs to be the most active, the second needs to be the second. So this blue is first, orange is second, green is third. And I have a network that successfully maintains the order after the item has long gone. So the item just comes on transiently. And that involves some, a version of self-excitation that is kind of sensitive to a few factors. But basically, setting up this sort of thing is not too complicated and very useful. And interestingly, if you look at this profile, just the shape of it, not the exact geometry, this transient up followed by a flattening is a really common neural response pattern. Karthik and Nico, you've probably seen this a lot, where there's the initial sensory evoked or stimulus evoked part of a neural response in lots of parts of the cortex. And then sometimes it goes all the way down to nothing and then comes back up to this sort of plateau.
Yep.
Karthik, do you see that in LIP
So in more like visual cortical areas, it's closer to the fact that you'll have this huge stimulus response and then it'll plateau immediately. But then once you go into say LIP or any of those working memory like areas, like once you introduce the delay period, they'll go completely to zero, almost like flat, like not zero, I shouldn't say zero. It's like it almost flat lines to the bottom and then it'll kind of come up during the delay period. It's pretty interesting behavior.
Interesting.
Pretty remarkably well in LIP and other parietal areas as well. Yeah.
Well, with LIP, I mean, there's two classes of, well, there's many classes of cells. There is a class of cell that looks just like this. But then there's also classes of cells that do what Karthik said, and then there's classes of cells that just have no memory trace at all.
Okay. So
so they have
preserve
dual peaked responses at the saccade, at the visual onset and at the saccade.
So in the firing rate domain, do you, or even some sort of cumulative rate, do you see evidence for a primacy gradient? Meaning that the firing, if you order the firing rates, you get something like the order in which something was presented?
So I think the paper to look at for that, and LIP and PFC behave very differently, would be Suzuki and Gottlieb.
Yeah.
And basically what they did there was showed that LIP had no distractor suppression and prefrontal cortex does.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So if you had a working memory like trace in LIP, it would get kind of contaminated by distractors.
That prefrontal cortex successfully suppresses distractor memory traces, and LIP does not.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to stop share. And yeah, so I just a short presentation today. Next week we'll maybe have a lot more art-related stuff. Yeah,
Nico, I found I found the Celeste slides from forever ago. It looks like a PowerPoint from the 90s, but hold on.
You can share. Yeah, go ahead.
But are you recording? We might have to turn off.
You want me to not record? I can turn it off.
Yeah, I mean, this is embarrassing, obviously.
Okay, fine. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.